Whether in Iran, Syria, Lebanon, or one of the 20 countries under the boot of U.S. sanctions, the Trump administration is using its economic weight to try to push regime change or major policy changes in countries around the globe. The U.S. sanctions against Iran are particularly brutal. Although food and medicines are technically exempt from sanctions, U.S. sanctions against Iranian banks like Parsian Bank, Iran's largest non-state-owned bank, make it nearly impossible to process payments for imported goods. And that includes food and medicine. The resulting shortage of medicines is sure to cause thousands of preventable deaths in Iran, and the victims will always be ordinary working people. U.S. officials say that sanctions will benefit the people of Iran by pushing them to rise up and overthrow their governments. Since the use of force, coups, and covert operations to overthrow foreign governments have proven catastrophic in Afghanistan, Iraq, Haiti, Somalia, Honduras, Libya, Syria, Ukraine, and Yemen, sieges and sanctions alone are seldom successful in achieving their alleged aims. Sieges and sanctions are the means to soften up the target to then allow for an easier all-out attack. The economic war waged against Iran by the U.S. and its allies is a war crime under the UN Charter and international law and must be exposed as such. The reason we should care is not only due to the gross injustice, but because it is a slippery slope. Today it is Iran, and tomorrow it will be another country the U.S. seeks to control. Welcome to the MidEaStream. I'm Marwa Osman. The U.S. sanctions against Iran are brutal. While they have utterly failed to advance U.S. regime change goals, they have provoked growing tensions with U.S. trading partners across the world and inflicted terrible pain on the ordinary people of Iran. To discuss this issue with us from Belgrade is Joaquin Flores, editor at Fortress. Thank you very much for being with us, Joaquin.
Thanks for having me.
Now, through its control over the world banking system, the U.S.'s sanctioning power defies international human rights law and poses a threat to the world. To put it plainly, the U.S. sanctions against Iran are put forward to kill ordinary Iranians. How can this be stopped?
Well, that's a very good question. Clearly, the U.S. sanctions are contrary to human rights and international law, and they constitute both crimes against humanity because they're a form of collective punishment, which is a crime, and a form of warfare, in fact, as you mentioned. So how it can be stopped, however, is not so obvious. In terms of influencing U.S. policy on Iran, really only Israel and to a lesser extent Saudi Arabia can claim this honor. So I think that one of the things we should look at in terms of practical application is the creation of global international media in the English language that gets around a lot of the censorship that we see from the big Silicon Valley big tech firms that are based in the United States. Mm-hmm. And that's going to require actually probably a whole concerted effort through many different actors working together to create these alternative nodes of information. But it's not just getting the message out there. I think that overall Iran has to continue to make the U.S. sanctions less and less relevant. But I think that the U.S.'s declining role in the global economy is making U.S. sanctions less relevant in the mid to long term. Of course, it doesn't take away from the absolute pain and unnecessary deaths being caused or will be caused in the short term, but medium to long term, U.S. sanctions and their effects are actually wearing off.
Mm-hmm. Well, to get a sense of the size of these impacts of these sanctions on the Iranian population, it's useful to compare them to what it would look like inside the U.S. economy. For example, if applied to the U.S., if these sanctions are applied to the United States, sanctions would be comparable to a 16% cut in federal budget, or a $521 billion in 2018. That would also represent about 85% of non-military spending inside of the U.S. Add to that the fact that Iran cannot borrow money to fill the deficit without creating more economic difficulties. Iranians already know the reasons behind those sanctions, why those sanctions are being put against them, against the government. But does the American citizen, do all American citizens fathom the idea and understand why their government is actively suffocating ordinary Iranians?
I think that Americans are getting a much better idea of what U.S. sanctions are doing overall, especially with regard to countries like Iran and countries like Venezuela, which is why I think that leading opposition candidates in the U.S. despite what they'll do once elected. They're at least now speaking very strong words against these policies. But citizens won't be able to get this information as readily if the internet continues to shut down and cordon off. The U.S. is used to being able to accuse other countries of doing this, and it abused social media in the form of Twitter storms and so forth to stoke unrest and target countries. But when those countries figured out how to use social media themselves, then the U.S. began to shut down the internet. That's one of the biggest problems.
Well, again, more than that, it's maybe also to do with the brainwashing campaign that's being put forward in the U.S. media in specific and international media as well, I think.
I think that's absolutely true. I think one of the things to understand, that the U.S. needs to understand, is that Iran is a democratic republic and will have to look more closely at issues of its own internal economy in terms of fighting this. So the thing is that Iran has tremendous resources, and while it's always everyday people that bear the main brunt of these kinds of sanctions, I have confidence that Iran will be able to stave off some of the immediate consequences in the short term. And midterm, I think that things are more optimistic in terms of the rising price of oil overall.
Well, Iran cannot find buyers for its own oil in the open market, obviously, and it cannot buy food or medicine also in the open market. In effect, it is cut off from the U.S.-dominated international financial system. How realistic is it for countries that fall under these U.S. crippling sanctions to break free from this U.S.-dominated financial system?
So the concept of globalization has worked against the concept of import substitution industrialization, but many experts today are pointing towards the end of globalization, which is really code for US-dominated global hegemonic monopolarity. So I think that this maybe means we should revisit questions of import substitution industrialization. We should recall that in the self-criticisms that the Venezuelan government gave of themselves, they rightly stated that what they should have been doing when things were better was to industrialize and create these industries, which now they're relying on for imports at incredibly jacked up prices, which make it most difficult for needy demographics in their population to access. We're talking about basic medicine and healthcare needs, like you mentioned. So I think that moving forward, we're going to be looking at more of a return to economists, sovereign economists in Iran, talking about import substitution and industrialization.
We did see a couple of deals being made, for example, with China. A huge deal was made last week between Iran and China, and there's a prospect of also new deals being built between Russia and China as well. Do you think this would be able to bypass this US-dominated financial system?
Absolutely. Economies of scale that rely on imported energy, such as China or working with Russia, will continue to play an important role here. I would even project that India will soon realize that the rising oil prices make diversification of resources a necessity, and we should expect a reversal of their own policy in the midterm. Nothing to bank on, given how tricky their leadership can be, but nevertheless it makes sense from an economic standpoint. I would also include that the EU is showing signs of establishing both economic and military independence from the US, so it's only a matter of time before its political system catches up with that new reality.
Well, talking about Iran in specific, given the events that have been happening over the past couple of weeks, starting with the Abqaiq bombing of the Aramco oil fields in Saudi Arabia and going on to certain political tension in the region as well, things seems to be going against Iran's will, again with more sanctions to be put against the Islamic Republic of Iran from the Trump administration. What exactly is Trump aiming for at this, knowing that the already put sanctions are hard enough? What does he want, knowing that when he goes harder, Iran will just say no harder?
So it's normal for US politicians, even before Trump, this is not a new paradigm, to try to leverage blame for what the U.S. is doing to Iran on Iranian leadership. And this never works. Iranian voters don't buy it. The global media doesn't buy it. It's really something that's only true within the echo chamber of U.S.-dominated media. But the U.S. also has to realize that such a view and their practices only lead to changes in Iranian government that are just as firmly against U.S. policy as the present ones. The only real changes this pressure might create are more active maneuvers on the part of the EU that will entice it to break from U.S. financial interdependence. This is because if we actually look at the history of this, of the deals that were being made going back a dozen years ago, the EU actually wanted to have warm relations with Iran and actually wanted these trade deals to happen, and with oil and so forth. And so these sanctions are something that the EU is trying to work around, but doesn't have the political willpower yet to do it. So, but I think in the mid to long term, things will be more optimistic.
Well, the U.S. officials typically place responsibility for the social and the economic hardships resulting from those sanctions on the Iranian government. That is satire. It's more satire than it is actual facts. How far do you think the U.S. is willing to go further to pressure the Iranian government, and will it succeed in doing so?
The thing is that there's limits to what can be done, and the U.S. has already hit those limits. I think that a lot of this is for satiating U.S. AIPAC, which is one of the most powerful, influential foreign lobbyists on the U.S. Congress. And in turn, they also have a lot of tremendous pressure on the U.S. president, on Trump. And this is really Israeli policy in the Middle East. But there's really no viable way that the U.S. can maintain this. And as we've seen, when this type of pressure on Iranian society is very transparent, and it only leads to the Iranian population giving more support to its government because they view the government as being able to work a way around it. Look, the truth is that in the past 40 years, the Iranian government has shown that it is able to create policies and to engage in foreign relations in such a way that are beneficial for all Iranian people. So I don't see that changes in the near future. So I think the U.S. understands this on a fundamental level, but they're locked into a certain strange foreign relationship with Israel.
Well, I want to thank you very much, Mr. Joaquin Flores, editor at For Truth, for joining us in this section. And please stay tuned for the upcoming section.